I'm going to turn it over here. I realize I have not introduced myself. My name is Jessica Bennett. I work at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, and my role in Aspire is to serve as the project manager for iChange, our institutional change initiative. So I work closely with the 35 institutions who are currently in the iChange network, and then also I liaise with our I Aspire Leadership Academy staff and kind of make sure we're in line there. So thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly now.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's really lovely to be with all of you again. Thank you so much for joining us today, of course, for this amazing and incredible keynote that we're about to have. But thank you also for joining us for the past 3 days. This has been quite an endeavor and an exploration of this online space and whether or not we could do this summit. And so many people have worked so hard on planning this event. So just want to publicly acknowledge them and say thank you so much for all of this work. And I think it's really been a rewarding time that hopefully has allowed you to reflect on your own practice, your work on your campus, and also how we can be more intentional about how we partner across campuses and how we can do this work in meaningful and intentional ways moving forward, particularly at this critical moment where there's so much happening in our nation and in our world. So with that, we wanted to organize a closing keynote that ultimately helps us reflect on what we've talked about over the last few days, but also help us think about moving forward and how do we carry this work forward into the next weeks and months and years to come. So the title of our keynote is Exploring Sustaining Organizational Change in Crisis, Learning from Past Change. We want to learn from past change efforts. We want to identify challenges and opportunities of this current moment, and we want to retain an equity lens as we manage and we push into these change moments, into these critical moments. And I can't imagine two better people to have this conversation with than Dr. Ann Austin and Dr. Leslie Gonzalez, who are both at Michigan State University. That is not why we chose them, but it is a happy coincidence. So first I'll start with Dr. Austin, who is a University Distinguished Professor at Michigan State University, where she teaches in the higher education, or the higher adult and lifelong education program. She also serves as Associate Dean for Research in the College of Education and Interim Associate Provost for Faculty and Academic Staff Development. She has all the jobs. Her research and publications concern academic work, careers and professional development, organizational change in higher education, doctoral education, and STEM education in higher ed. Her recent and current funded projects focus on major organizational change issues in higher education, strategies for creating more inclusive academic workplaces, the preparation of future STEM faculty as effective teachers, reform in teaching evaluation, and the nature and functioning of networks and of organizations committed to strengthening undergraduate education. So we are so excited to hear your comments, Dr. Austin. And I will also introduce Dr. Leslie Gonzalez, who is an associate professor also in the higher adult and lifelong learning unit at Michigan State. She studies the academic profession, particularly the evaluation of scholars and their scholarship, with a specific interest in understanding how evaluation norms and practices mediate opportunity for historically underrepresented individuals. She serves as the Faculty Excellence Advocate in the College of Education at Michigan State and is an associate editor for the Review of Higher Education. She earned her doctoral and master's degrees at the University of Texas at El Paso and her bachelor's degree from New Mexico Highlands University, which are both Hispanic serving institutions, and gives her a unique perspective and unique context within which to do her work. So again, thank you both so much for joining us. I have a short set of questions that I'll ask, and then we'll transition just as quickly as we can to questions from the audience and fielding some of those questions so that we have as much time as possible to really hear what y'all want to know more about. So first, there's been no shortage of initiatives, as we've seen, focusing on addressing increasing faculty diversity. This work is not new. Folks have been engaging in it for decades now, but we haven't made much progress. So when you think about your own work, your own personal experiences, your professional experiences, your scholarship, what mistakes do you see institutions making over and over again? And maybe we can start with you, Dr. Austin.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kimberly. I'm happy to answer that question. I just wanted to start also by just thanking you for the invitation to be part of this group. To be honest, in this really, really difficult week for everyone, and recognizing that this is a pretty momentous time in our nation's history as we grapple with these very hard challenges around race and inclusion. Being able to think about this session has been meaningful to me, and this gives a little bit of a modest way to make a contribution. So thank you so much. The question about what mistakes do I see, I think, is what you're asking. And I was reflecting a bit. I have had the privilege, really, to be involved for quite a long time with the advanced program that NSF has sponsored, and I'm sure many people on the call have been also. And that's been a program going on, I think, maybe now 15 or 18 years, I'm not sure how long, focused on greater inclusion and diversity in the academy. It certainly began with a focus on gender equity, but has expanded to issues around race and ethnicity. So because I've been involved as an evaluator and I've studied aspects of that program and what strategies have been used, I actually get called quite a lot when there are new opportunities for institutions to put in proposals. And lots of times people will call and say, gosh, could you tell us the 3 or 4 basic strategies that we should put into our proposal? And after a while, I began to realize there was a pattern, and I thought about it a lot. And as I thought about some of my research with advanced programs and my experience, what I've realized is there's often a mistake, I think, if we would frame it that way, of not taking a systems approach, not recognizing that the problems that we're dealing with in terms of how do we actually go about creating more inclusive, diverse, equitable environments, these are systemic issues, and they require what I would call a systems approach. And just really briefly, what I would think about in that, and when I talk to people who call me as they're especially writing proposals, I say, think really carefully. If you're going to take a systems approach, think about your context. What's unique about your institution? One easy example I sometimes give is an institution in a very rural area has somewhat different challenges than an institution in an urban area. If you think about partners in a very rural area, it's hard to find positions maybe for partners who are coming with an academic. In an urban area, that's not such an issue. So I say, think about what are the particular contextual issues? What are the specific problems in your institution? Is it around that you're doing well with hiring, but maybe the culture is not creating an environment where people feel that they're welcome and want to stay? What are the issues? So thinking about context, thinking about the problem, and then thinking about what I would call the constellation, the range of strategies that together add up to more than each one does alone. To me, those are a few aspects of taking a systems approach, and not doing that is what I often see might be a mistake. Just to add a little point to that, an additional related issue, I think, is sometimes that we don't really see the complexities of the issues that the problems that we're dealing with, that recognizing that we have structural racism, that we have cultural problems, that the culture has happened in a certain way over many, many years, and that we really have to think about what are traditions, what are norms. We have to go more deeply into the organization. These are complex issues. And therefore, I think the mistake sometimes is that we don't realize how persistent that we have to be, that this is work for the long haul. It's not, gee, maybe we could have a mentoring program. Mentoring programs are wonderful, but that's not the end. That we have to be ready to roll up our sleeves and go step by step, day by day, month by month, year by year. These are long, persistent, there are structures and habits and norms that we're challenging, and it's going to require persistence, community, and effort for a long period of time. So I would say my 2 mistakes I'd hold up are not thinking as systemically as we might, and not fully realizing that we have to be in this for the long haul.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gonzalez, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, sure. So I also want to go ahead and start with just a word of thanks. Thank you everyone for being here today and for tuning in, and to everyone for the invitation. I want to acknowledge and premise my comments by saying that I'm able to do much of the learning and growth that I do because I work at a land grant institution which occupies native land. And if that's something new that folks are thinking about, there's lots of resources that I'm willing to help and provide about the relation between higher education and native land. So the mistakes that I can think about in terms of fostering organizational change, or what are some of the missteps, I think I'll focus on two. And one of them is sort of similar to Anne's in that I think oftentimes when we're thinking about how to diversify the faculty or how to diversify recruitment pools or practices, we're thinking about practices or strategies in a really isolated way. And I think that it's always really helpful to sort of step back and ask ourselves, but why do we need these practices? And that's a little bit about knowing your context, to Anne's point, but it's also about being willing to interrogate what is the history of our institution. What is the history of higher education when it comes to thinking about where we look to when we think about recruiting new faculty members, for example? Or what does the history tell us about what a high quality scholar's profile needs to look like? And so it's really difficult to create truly inclusive environments if we're not really to sort of take a step back and think about historically how our institutions have come to be. And so second, and kind of related to this first point, is when engaging in organizational change and transformation efforts, particularly related to DEI, in order to interrogate the history, we've got to be willing to embrace that this requires ongoing learning. And this requires sort of an investment and requires that leadership model from the top, an investment in learning about the history of colleges and universities, the history of the academic disciplines, and particularly in this case, we're talking about the STEM disciplines. But there's a whole lot of literature that can tell us about how did colleges and universities get developed? How did the academic sciences form? How did the academic sciences form in ways that are implicated in racism? We have to understand sort of that longer history of the practices and the norms if we really want to be able to push the needle in terms of cultural change. Cultural changes can't come from a set of practices or a set of workshops or even having an office on campus that looks at this. Mm-hmm. It's got to come through deep and persistent learning, to Anne's point.
Yeah, I love the way that you both talk about culture as not just being located in an institution, but also in a discipline. And then also it's all nested in history and organizational structure, right? Like that it's really, really embedded, and that this change is going to take a long period of time and a sustained effort and lots of learning. Mm-hmm. I wanted to make sure that we asked, so, you know, as we take on these big complex challenges, right? These multi-layered, multi-dimensional challenges, where do you think institutions should be focusing their efforts? So we often have this discourse around, okay, so should we institute policies and programs, or should we really try to focus on getting people on board with the moral imperative or changing hearts and minds? So how do you folks think about the approach? Should it be more of a hearts and minds moral imperative approach, or let's change structures and systems approach? And why don't we start with you this time, Dr. Gonzalez?
Thanks for this question. This is a really hard question, right? Especially as we think about resources. But I think that still I'm going to offer a challenging response. I think that it has to be an every dimension, every angle possible sort of strategy. And so when I think about what does it take to push the needle on inclusivity and equity, I think that it's helpful if we start from the point where we're thinking about strategies, you know, as we talked about earlier. So building a more racially, gender, ability diverse pool of faculty from which we're thinking about in recruiting. And we think about how folks might bring into the academy with them different ways of doing science, different ways of doing their work. So that also means as we're recruiting differently and thinking about faculty pools differently, we've got to simultaneously be thinking about how do we have to then build policies or reform policies that will not only see different kinds of work, but value different kinds of work? What are the kinds of changes and conversations we have to be having across the board with faculty, in provost offices, with chairs and deans, thinking about what do we have to change in terms of our evaluation patterns? How do we have to talk and think about science and the dissemination of science work in different ways? We know from the literature that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes scientists of color will say that they are coming into science because they're driven by a desire for social change, to be connected to their communities, to make impact in their communities. Well, how is that accounted for then in the evaluation policies? How are we making space for that in terms of how we do tenure and promotion, how we award prestigious fellowships and that sort of thing? And so then we're thinking about, strategies and individuals, policies and cultural change. And we've got to also be thinking about how do we also foster that deep learning that I just talked about, right? Because we can change policy, we can write a new policy, but folks we know from the literature are going to fall back on those sort of habits of evaluation that we already know. So how do we build in opportunities to continually learn and interrogate our own practices and sort of catch ourselves and say, whoa, I'm kind of falling back on a really narrow understanding of what science research, science habits needs to look like. How can we think about this a slightly different way? So I think it has to always be sort of a multi-dimensional approach.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Austin?
Well, I'm going to follow right in the footsteps of my colleague, Dr. Gonzalez, who is a pleasure to work with and has a lot of insights. I'll probably say some of the same ideas, but in my own way, which maybe will punctuate them since we're saying similar things here. I don't think this is an either or. I think you use the word, Kimberly, the moral imperative aspect or the more structural approach. I think, as Leslie has said, we really have to think and do both. I had the opportunity to listen to the recording of Dr. Malcolm and Dr. Jones a couple days ago, which was very, very inspiring. And I think they were talking also about the issue of framing and raising up, making clear the moral imperative. The way I sometimes think about it often is that excellence absolutely requires diversity and the inclusion of diverse voices. We simply cannot have institutional excellence or the kind of society we want if we do not have diverse voices, diverse participation, inclusion, and equity. So it is not an add-on or a nice thing to do. It's absolutely essential for the excellence that we profess is what we want and we sincerely want, we not only profess, we want our institutions to be excellent in their own way for their own missions. But that absolutely requires diversity, inclusion, and equity. So that's the moral imperative, and to me at least. And I think that our leaders, and when I say our leaders, I don't only mean our presidents and provosts and deans, but every single one of us who is committing ourselves to making the academy and our society moving toward what we want is a leader in that regard, or striving to be. So I think we have to be willing to say what that moral imperative is. And it's partly we say it because we have to know what we're doing, why we're doing it. But I also think it inspires us. It helps us remember why this hard work, why are we doing it? And when we make mistakes, which I make all the time, it helps us keep on realizing we're working together towards something that is essential for the good of our world and for all of us as individuals. So that's that part. But then at the same time, and so I think that message has to be said over and over and over again, not just once, but we have to remind ourselves, and when I say the we, all of us working together in a committee meeting, if we're the dean, if we're the provost, as we talk to our friends, that has to be our commitment and our conversation. At the same time, I think we absolutely, as Leslie has said, we really need to think in very practical kinds of ways about, structurally. I like to use the term that we need to use multiple levers for change, and we have to think about we need multiple levers, and we have to think about multiple levels. And what I mean by that is we need to think about the structural levers. Leslie mentioned some of them. You know, how do we do search processes? How do our promotion and tenure processes work? And so on. But we also need to think, I mean, politically, who has power and influence? How do we create coalitions? Who can be helpful in this work forward? I think we need to think about professional development and leadership development in advance. Those have been very important in the advanced program, very important levers for change. And then I think another lever is symbolically. How do we use symbolic kinds of things? And I think when some of us were talking the other night, I was giving an example of that one of the advanced institutions I just was quite impressed with this. On one of their holiday greeting cards from the institution after they had their advanced grant, they put on their holiday card, happy holidays to everybody. And then they said something like, one of the things we're grateful for in this time of this, season of gratitude is that we're committing ourselves to an advanced grant to move forward on issues of equity and inclusion and diversity. That was a symbolic way, very practical, but very symbolic. So we need lots of different levers. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to add one other little example. I know of another institution in advance where their senior leaders who were quite good at the framing of the moral imperative. Both the president and provost departed. And that was a bit of a blow to their advanced program. And what they did, I thought they were so very strategic. The leaders of the advanced program said, okay, we acknowledge this is hard, but what we're going to do now is work really hard to get people elected to our Senate, our governing structure in the university for faculty. And we are going to tackle in the Senate specific procedural and policy things and around tenure and promotion and hiring, a variety of things, and family-friendly practices in that situation. And so they kind of pivoted, to use a word we all use right now, knowing that the framing at the senior level wasn't quite what it had been. They said, we're not going to be deterred. We're going to push hard now on these structural policies, get them embedded, because if they're embedded, that's going to really help us move forward. I thought that was very strategic and thoughtful, and shows how we need the framing and we need the practical policies and structural kinds of things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So I just want to invite the members of our audience that are watching with us. We're going to ask one more question, but then we also want to turn to your questions. So please use this as a moment to think about some of the things that you might be wondering about in your own change efforts, and offer us some questions to consider. And of course, we have tons of questions and could sit here and chat with the two of you all day long. But you folks have offered so many different ideas, and I think, given that there are so many potential strategies, there are so many different things to think about. And there's always crisis after crisis after crisis and other things to distract their attention. When I think about provosts and presidents and deans, that, it can feel a little bit haphazard. It can feel difficult to center issues related to equity and justice in these types of moments. So based on your own research and your own experiences, what are some of the things that institutional leaders, presidents, provosts, deans can do to recenter and refocus and keep equity at the center, and also catalyze change that's going to have some of that long-term stickiness that you were just talking about, Dr. Austin? We can start with you. Yeah, we can start with you, and maybe go to Dr. Gonzalez.
And so this year, especially asking what could presidents and provosts, some of the senior leaders especially do? Did I hear the question correctly? Mm-hmm. I just want to make sure I heard that right. One of the things I think that they can do is think about issues around accountability. And I think, and encourage the institution. The first thing they can do, I actually already have spoken to, so I won't linger on it. I think the critical strategy that presidents and provosts can do is frame the issue and continue to frame it over and over again and connect it to the moral imperative of the excellence of the institution. I'm not a president or provost, but if I were, I would, I think all of us really can, but that is a critical message that I think especially a president and provost can do. Keep that message in front. And I think, as Dr. Jones and Dr. Malcolm said, keep on emphasizing the commitments to equity, to diversity, and to inclusion are not nice to do things. They are not, things that if we have enough time, maybe we get to. They are absolutely essential for what the missions of our institutions are and how well we do those missions. So that, I think, is the critical thing that presidents and provosts can do. In addition to that, I think presidents and provosts, especially provosts, often are working with the deans, and they're working with different associate provosts in different parts of the university. And I think that they can actually build in some expectations and accountability. How could they do that? Well, one way I think is, for example, a provost could be working with deans to say, this needs to be a priority in your annual planning. So as deans, please be thinking about this with your colleagues, with your department chairs, with the people in your departments. And we'll be looking, in our annual discussions about the priorities and the accomplishments, we'll be looking, to talk together about what kind of progress, where are the challenges, how can I as a provost help you? But how are you as the dean making this very centered in your work within your unit? I think another thing, and when the advanced program, I think, has both wrestled with and advanced this notion of metrics and accountability. It's very hard to, some of the metrics you can look at hiring and who stays and who leaves, things like that. But the deeper cultural metrics are really sometimes hard to get to. So wrestling with those, trying to figure out in the context, what would tell us if we're moving forward? And coupling that with a recognition that what we decide on might not change a whole lot each year, but are we kind of testing ourselves, monitoring ourselves, so that we're holding ourselves accountable? And how are we using data, I think, can be very useful. One of the advanced institutions I worked with, as an example here, they use data not in a sort of a gotcha way, but in a way of saying, let's work together, to use Leslie's word, to learn together. So this particular advanced institution, and I think others have done this, use data around graduates in different fields of study and the diversity of graduates. And each year, I think they'd have a luncheon or breakfast and bring together department chairs and say, here's the data that we've found for you in your field. These are the graduates that are coming out, or the postdocs, depending on the field. These are the people, the picture, the demographics of people that you might consider as you're hiring. And then they use those data to foster conversations. And I was at one of these breakfasts where people were looking at each other kind of department chair to department chair saying, how do yours compare to mine? And gee, I don't think we're doing so well. And it was very collegial. It was not, as I say, heavy-handed. It was sort of, let's learn together. Let's think about these issues together. And so that was a really useful use of data. So I guess there's many other things to say about presidents and provosts, but right now I might highlight this constant framing and thinking symbolically about how can you raise up these issues, how the issue of being committed to advancing around diversity and equity and inclusion. That's one part. And then using data to help people, learn together and be accountable, but also to help the problem have some substance to it where we can sort of get our hands around it. I think those might be 2 points that I would think of suggesting to presidents and provosts.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Austin. And Dr. Gonzalez?
Sure. So I think I'm going to circle back to one of my earlier points around the importance of learning, and which Anne just kind of talked about as well. Anne mentioned a moment ago that, we make mistakes when we're engaging in diversity work on campuses. We are all going to make mistakes. Folks of color are going to make mistakes. White folks are going to make mistakes. And so one of my key takeaways would be for leaders to seriously invest in the kind of infrastructure that is available to help folks cope with those mistakes. And what I mean by that is, just in the last few weeks, or in the last few days, we've seen a lot of statements going out. The impact of those statements can certainly be questioned, but some of those statements are better than others. I will be very forward to say that. Which leads me, and so what happens when a statement sort of falters or falls short? And a leader has to have the infrastructure, the go-to people behind them so they could say, like, all right, we made a mistake. Now, what is the next course of action? How do we learn from this? And how do we apologize? And how do we do better? So it takes a real commitment to learning. Related to that, and I think that this is incredibly important and something that I do want to put on the table, engaging in diversity work, you know, sort of broadly stated, it's not a neutral endeavor. And so I think that folks that are sitting in leadership positions, particularly those formal positional leadership positions, you can't diversify the faculty unless you're willing to say that equity is important and that changes have to come. And those changes are going to make some folks feel uncomfortable. It's going to feel like loss to some folks. Folks that have been benefiting from a system that has really privileged them or positioned them in a way, they're going to be dealing with a different kind of a system. And so one of my most favorite texts on helping leaders sort of think about the power and the politics that are inevitably embedded in diversification work is Lori Santamaria and Andres Santamaria's book, which is called, I actually have it here for folks, Culturally Responsive Leadership in Higher Education. One of the reasons that I love this text is because it's filled with case studies, real case studies of folks who have engaged in diversity work, who are committed to equity, who share about their mistakes, and who talk about the strategies and, again, the ongoing commitment to learning. So this work it cannot be neutral. It has to be embraced sort of head on. And I'll give just one quick example of the importance of sort of staying away from neutrality as sort of a safe touchstone, because I think that's what neutrality often represents for folks, sort of a safe touchstone. We're comfortable when we have neutral policies, when things can sort of be framed as being the same or equal across the board for folks, right? That feels comfortable to lots of us. However, we know from the literature, and this is something that Kim and I wrote about in a recent report dealing with how institutions can think about supporting faculty post-COVID. We know from the research on family-friendly policies, particularly parental leave policies, that really do stem from a lot of Advance's work, which Anne has been talking about, that those policies are great. They're important advances, but they can't be implemented in neutral ways. Similarly, tenure clock extensions, which lots of institutions have just adopted because of COVID, they can't be implemented in neutral ways. We've got to be thinking about, okay, we are pausing the tenure clock or giving folks an extension. Now, what do we have to think about in terms of how we evaluate productivity after the tenure clock sort of kicks back in? And how have our communities, our faculty communities, been impacted differently by COVID? You know, a different productivity is not just because we're all working from home, although that is, you know, definitely shaped my own work productivity. But it's also because different groups of faculty are dealing with rates of infection and loss at very different rates. And so we have to acknowledge that folks are going to require different kinds of support. Folks are going to require us to think about evaluation in the post-COVID years really carefully and thoughtfully, and not with a neutral lens. So those are some of my key takeaways.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. I hate to cut you both short, but we are going to transition now to Katie Dixie, who's going to lead us through some questions that have come from the audience.
Thank you so much. I think those are such wonderful points, and I'm really just, this has been wonderful. One of the questions that's kind of come in is, I would love to hear about collegial collaborations between institutions as we think about catalytic funding and the potential for this group during and beyond the iChange Alliance, and probably also relevant for everyone here in Aspire in regards to funding. Let's see. Anne, did you?
Oh, it looked like Leslie was speaking, but I think she might be muted.
No, I was thinking, Anne, I think, would you like to take that one?
Sure, I can start with this. Katie, I think it's a question, I just want to make sure I understood it, about how like a network like Aspire can really make a difference. Is my understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think, and thinking about how collaborations between institutions and thinking about funding as well, and how that might play in.
Yeah, okay.
I believe
Yeah,
is how I interpreted it as well.
let me do my best. One of the things as I was thinking about what Leslie and I have shared already, that I was thinking we had not yet mentioned as much maybe as it would be relevant, and it may relate to this question, is how important, at least I think, building communities are, and building communities within our institutions, creating coalitions, or we sometimes call them allies. That's really, really important. But I think this question relates to what I would call the notion of building communities across institutions. And I've been thinking about that more and more the last couple of years. I'm involved in a project that the National Science Foundation is supporting to study networks of organizations. And we're studying ones that are focused on change in undergraduate education, but we're trying to learn a lot about these networks. And I think some of you may know I've been involved also in not only advanced, but like in the CERTL network. And so I've thought a lot about networks. And I think the couple things that I might share, I absolutely think the community, that when we're thinking about systems change, we've been talking especially about the university or the college as a system. But of course, the system is much bigger. It's the whole higher education system within the broader society. And it's not only higher ed, as I think Dr. Jones and Dr. Malcolm are mentioning, it's the connections with our K-12 system. And I would say also with employers and with the broader system, situates higher education in interaction with our K-12 colleagues and partners, with the workplace, with the funding agencies, with the government agencies. I'm probably leaving out somebody, the nonprofits, but that bigger system is important. Why then, if we're thinking about that, if we're really going, the kind of changes we're interested in are societal issues. And so I think we really have to think in a systems way with the whole society. What might come about from institutions working together? Well, I think sharing ideas is probably, we would notice that right away. We can share ideas with each other. And I don't want to diminish that, because I think that's tremendously important. What's working here? What's working there? What isn't working? And problem solving together. I think there's something also to be said for what I call walking the path together, that is upholding each other, helping each other, reminding each other when it gets hard. And I say reminding each other, institutions reminding each other. I also think that leaders of institutions oftentimes, I think, want to know they are walking with other institutional leaders, K-12 leaders, community college leaders, research university leaders, even the funding agencies. There's support from that, but there's also a symbolic value. And I think I've mentioned symbolism a little bit before. When we're changing cultures and norms and values and beliefs, as well as actions, all of those are important. I think we also need to think, in addition to the practical things, about the symbolic, how do we use symbols? And when there's an alliance, like the Aspire Alliance, I mean, there's all the sharing of ideas and helping solve problems together. But I think there's a strong symbolic reason to do that, to say we are walking together this path. We're upholding each other. We're trying to hold each other accountable. We're learning together, as Leslie said. And we are about contributing to the society and making our society better. And we want to join with our partners, whether it be a 4-year institution, with a 2-year institution, or with a funding agency, or with the national academies, or an employment opportunity in a region. We together care about these issues. I think that sense of it's the collective impact and the collaborative action is incredibly important when we're talking about deeply embedded, as Leslie said, historically based challenges that around racism, that we have to be able to work together to really see progress, I think. And I just will add a final sentence. In terms of the funding, I do think, NSF's commitment has been, I think, demonstrated with the Includes opportunities. I certainly can't speak for NSF, but I do think that there's ongoing interest. I involved in some work with the national academies, and there's lots of commitment and interest there. So I do think all of us can, I would hope, expect to see continued opportunities for funding, because I do think there's growing recognition that this is all about collaboration, and it needs to be about collaboration and collective work together. I hope I got somewhere in the approximate area where that question was.
Leslie, did you have anything you'd like to add?
I'll add just a few points. This is a great question. It makes me think a lot about, I went to graduate school at University of Texas, El Paso, go Miners. And they had at that point, and I also taught while I was in graduate school, I taught at El Paso Community College. I taught there as an adjunct for 4 years in the government department, which I loved. It was a wonderful opportunity. And I'm thinking about the fact that UTEP and EPCC at that point, they had a pretty strong partnership, lots of support from Lumina at that point in time. This was years ago. But some of the really fascinating things that I remember from that partnership, speaking about collegiality and collaboration and really leveraging that for funding opportunities, is being able to think about institutions that are situated in a similar regional geographical ecosystem and being able to do some really in-depth asset mapping. So thinking about what are all the assets that, the El Paso Community College system has when it comes to thinking about diversifying the faculty, but also making the curriculum more inclusive, and also thinking about how to onboard faculty, right, for thinking about a culturally inclusive curriculum. I think oftentimes one of the things that we take for granted, and again, I've done a little bit of research on community colleges and I worked at one, I think sometimes we take for granted that because community colleges are often very racially, gender, ability diverse, class diverse, that they've got, all of that they're ready to go. And community colleges often can provide support, they have insights, but they also need support. And vice versa, right? Like community colleges can provide a lot of learning, a lot of insights to, local universities. So really trying to map out, like, what are the assets that we have in relation to onboarding, curriculum? What are the assets that we have when it comes to, in the El Paso context, working with a very binational population? And so I think that when you're thinking about collegiality in terms of institutional collaboration in a very similar ecosystem, really mapping out different kinds of assets can go a long way when speaking and engaging with funders. So yeah, that's some of the ideas that came to my mind immediately.
Great, thank you. And I know we're running a little short on time, but I'm seeing another question in the chat, and I think this is really related to what you were just talking about in terms of community college. And so how do you think we can raise the awareness of the community colleges as being fundamentally important in making a difference in the educational process for underrepresented people? So maybe there's a few things you might want to add on that, or
I'll just say something really quickly, and if you want to jump in on this, I think increasingly scholars that are situated in the field of higher education are thinking about the trajectories, the professional trajectories of folks that have attended or graduated from community colleges. I know that another member of their research team, Julia Savoy and Lucas Hill, have started to look at what are the trajectories and outcomes for community college students. Another scholar by the name of Erin Doran has looked at outcomes as well. So I think that one of the ways that we can really amplify the serious contributions that community colleges make is by highlighting folks that have attended and they're very diverse and really exciting outcomes. Folks can end up in graduate school, obviously, right? They can end up in any sort of various, professional capacities. And that is a very important way to kind of counter, going back to some of what I said earlier, counter where we need to think about where faculty come from. Faculty are, being educated this very moment at a number of institutions, including many community colleges. And we know that in our recruitment practices, we don't often think about that as being a sort of a pipeline into the professoriate. So those are some of the things that immediately jump to mind.
I'll add just a thought or two. I'm so glad that we're speaking specifically to community colleges, because I think that we need to, in the work that we're talking about, think about the whole system of higher education. And one of the really the parts of higher education in the United States that distinguishes us, I think, is that we have a whole variety of types of higher education institutions. I think that the more we can think not in any hierarchical way, but in a way that this is a rich picture, and that each of our higher education institutions is filling an absolutely essential and often unique role. And that together, if we can collaborate more than we often do across the different types of higher education institutions, that we will really be able to serve the society more fully. And I think one way to think about that, and Leslie was speaking about this a little bit in one of her examples, regionally, I think there's some very good examples of collaborations of two-year institutions, some of the four-year institutions without grad schools and the larger universities collaborating with workplaces and really thinking about the nature of work in a particular region, how that is being supported, how learners can find their place in different institutional types and together create a really great place to live in particular regions. So I would love to see us working more on across institution collaboration so that we really are both celebrating and kind of using our whole system of higher education in ways that are not competitive, but collaborative to serve the learners and to serve our society.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that's also so relevant to the work that we're trying to do here. So thank you very, very much to both of you for all of your wonderful insights. And it's just been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, and we just thank you as well. I couldn't think of two more outstanding, amazing, dear colleagues to close us out and to give us some really important ideas to think about as we all move forward with our change efforts. So thank you so much for your scholarship and for your insights and just for being thoughtful people that I enjoy talking with anytime I get a chance. So thank you very much. We appreciate you both. And as we start to transition and wrap up our Aspire Summit, I'd like to introduce Howard Godstein to close us out with some final remarks. So Howard.
Thank you all. How do I follow that? I'm the anticlimax today, by the way. There's no way that I can follow, particularly some of the people who I most admire. And I just thought that was an amazing session, just like there are 3 days of amazing sessions. And I thank all of you for your attendance and your contributions. I think this is going to be to remember. It's like we're in parallel worlds. We come with our professional selves, and we also come with our personal selves. We come with excitement, we come with energy towards change, but we also come with personal anguish and frustration and anger. But we came together. We came together because our work is so important and because we know this is at least one way to try to address society ills, racism, and broaden participation. So over the last few days, just very, very briefly, we heard from regional change how they might be trying to scale. What does that look like for them? How do they bring in more community colleges across the country? How do they make this a national effort? Is it more regional collaboratives? Is it institutional assessments, maybe in collaboration with local four-year institutions? Regional, I think, has a wonderful opportunity, particularly as we're going to increasingly see, I believe, more connections between 2- and 4-year institutions. I think that's going to be a mandate. From national change, how do they shift gears? They've done a phenomenal job over the last 3 months in putting on workshops and seminars and discussions as we've gone into the virtual world. They've been working closer with disciplinary societies. They've been doubling down to enhance inclusivity and pedagogy, advising, mentoring, and moving to a train-the-trainer opportunity to achieve far broader national scope. And then there's institutional change. And of course, this afternoon, they're talking about strategies. Should they have a pledge, an institutional pledge? What about collecting data? What about the visible membership in these networks? Does that help? What's their connection with efforts that their institutions are undertaking elsewhere, maybe to demonstrate broader institutional commitments? And how do they engage leadership to show the larger goals? So in summation, I've got maybe a few takeaways. I have to admit that I've stolen some of these from some of our speakers with maybe a little editorial license. First, all change is local. Context matters, as we've just heard discussed. Second, you can't know that you've changed what you cannot measure. Data is very important. Next, this is work for the long haul. There are multiple levels, multiple levers. It's the system, structures, norms, policies, and partners. Finally, excellence requires inclusion, diversity, and equity. It's not an add-on. It was just discussed. And we have to keep these issues of broadening participation as an essential moral imperative to the mission of all of our institutions. Finally, I think we in Aspire, and broadly our community, has an opportunity together. I think of it as a responsibility to create deep, sustained, collaborative networks, change the way the National Science Foundation, change the way our institutions, and change the way we individually help to sustain and to build and to transform all of the efforts that we have underway. We need to harvest your great ideas, your dedication, your commitment to transform, to ensure sustained systemic change. Now, as we just heard as well, each one of us are leaders. We're doing something essential for the good of our world that will inspire us and energize us, and we really thank you for doing it as part of Aspire. So thank you all so much for participating in this summit. I now turn over the screen to whomever's going to take it from me to end this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you for all of that. Again, just a big thank you to all of our facilitators, our presenters, my colleagues on the Summit Aspire Summit Planning Task Force, just everybody. There's been a lot of work and planning and thinking that's gone into creating this moment. There's been a lot of time set aside by all of our participants to join us. As always, we are evaluating our we're evaluating our meeting, and so please, if you have registered for our whole summit, please keep an eye out for an evaluation. Evaluation helps us learn, grow, and be better. I'm also just sharing a link in the chat right now. A participant suggested that folks might want to attend a conversation with President Obama at 5 o'clock, and you can't link from the Q&A, so I just wanted to repopulate that here. But again, we thank you, and I wish you all some time for rest and restoration and healing in the coming days, and we will be gathering again in our usual spaces as we move forward. So thank you so much, and have a good evening.